For years now, I've been seeing photos and videos floating around the internet of what looks to be a partially sunk cruise ship rusting away and covered in graffiti. I've always been curious about this wreck and what the story is behind it. So join me today as we uncover the storied career behind this once grand liner and find out how it ended up here. This is the story of the MS Mediterranean Sky. It began with the Ellerman Lines, at one point one of the largest shipping companies in the world, one which had been around since the late 19th century. They were well known for building passenger liners as well as cargo steamships, mostly situated in Europe. Following their financial struggles after losing various merchant ships during the Second World War, Ellerman Lines would construct a series of 4 sister ships in the early 1950s to better compete with the new modern ships of the time. These would be named the City of Port Elizabeth, City of Exeter, the City of York, and the City of Durban. The City of York, like her sisters, was launched in 1953 at around 16,500 gross tons, and was both a passenger liner as well as a cargo vessel. She was able to hold around 107 passengers, all in a first-class configuration. Despite having the appearance of a freighter and also having an impressive cargo capacity made up of various holds, City of York would also feature impressive passenger comforts for this type of ship, known as a combi. It was certainly the most luxurious in the Ellerman fleet, complete with a drawing room, children's facilities, a veranda cafe, a full promenade, a tennis court, and even an aft swimming pool. These facilities were actually quite nice too, with luxurious common area appointments, while some cabins featured their own en-suites and even air conditioning. The ships were primarily built for the London to South Africa line, as well as stops along the way like the Canary Islands. And City of York would sail these routes quite successfully, still providing passengers a comfortable ride while also transporting a good amount of cargo. The vessel was also fast, with a cruising speed of around 17 knots, allowing her and her sisters to complete the route in around 16 days. Very competitive for the time. The York and her sisters would also see brief service to other European countries, all while the ocean liner market continued to change through the 1960s. For a brief time, they would even act as cruise liners. Ellerman Lines would update the ship's interiors by the late 1960s, but the tough reality was that ocean liner travel was just becoming less and less popular, mostly thanks to the significant rise in air travel. That 16-day journey from London to South Africa, now in some cases, could take less than a day by flying. Ellerman Lines would lay the City of York and her sisters up for storage while they put them up for sale by the late 1960s. They would ultimately be purchased in 1971 by a man named Aristides Karageorgis. He was head of the Greek shipping company Karageorgis Lines. The company would purchase the City of York along with her 3 other sisters from her class. They bought these ships with the intention of rebuilding them as a mix between a cruise ship and a ferry. In the end though, only 2 of the 4 ships would actually see this concept through to fruition. The City of Exeter would become the Mediterranean Sea, and the City of York would transform into the MS Mediterranean Sky. Painted in a distinctive mustard yellow livery, eventually with the Karageorgis Lines logo affixed on the side of the hull, the new Mediterranean Sky shared almost nothing aside from its general shape of the hull from her former City of York configuration. The 1950s superstructure, the mast, as well as all of the original cranes had now been removed. In its place was a much more sleek and streamlined passenger-focused liner. The bow section would feature an elongated lounge with large windows facing forward. In addition to another 2 lounges, the ship would also have a main dining room for the 2 separate classes, as well as a few shops and 2 outdoor pools located on the aft decks. The overall square footage on board had been greatly increased, meaning there was now plenty more room for new cabins, some with up to 6 berths. This also now meant that the passenger capacity had been increased dramatically to over 800. But the ship's actual core makeup didn't really change. Mediterranean Sky was still a combi, meaning it had both passenger capacity as well as cargo capacity. The first few decks below the passenger accommodations was actually open space for cargo and even vehicles. A large shell door was added to the side of the hull to allow vehicles to drive on board. This meant the ship would be capable of serving as a ferry as well as a cruise ship, something Karageorgis Lines had planned to do. Indeed, for most of the 1970s and 80s, Mediterranean Sky and her sister, Mediterranean Sea, would run daily service from the Italian ports of Venice and Ancona direct to the Greek city of Patras. Sometimes, however, the Sky would sail 9-night round-trip cruises from Italy to Greece. This is largely how the Mediterranean sky would serve most of this time, outfitted as a stylish, sleek liner of the time and a reliable ship. By the late 1980s, she had been brought back to Greece and laid up in a bay, tied up right beside the former SS America, actually. From here, she would be chartered a few times during the early 1990s, notably used as a transport ship for US troops out of Somalia. Later, in 1994, she would be repainted in an all-new white livery and chartered by a company called Phoenix Cruises. They would send her out on short cruises to ports in countries like Egypt, Cyprus, and Israel. The United States military would once again charter the ship in late 1994, sailing her to Cuba as a host ship for US troops at Guantanamo Bay. But as the chartering contracts dried up, and with no desire to put the aging ship back into service, the vessel would be sold to a cruise company called Golden Cruises in 1995. From here, the Mediterranean sky would see very little use, only being sent on a few cruises into 1996. Her new owners just didn't take very good care of the ship, and as it continued to visibly deteriorate, they had fallen behind on fuel and port fees. Because of this, the ship would ultimately be seized and arrested in the Greek port of Patras, and towed to the Bay of Eleusis. This is where she would be anchored and tied to various other ships. Really though, this was a ship graveyard, many floating in purgatory, more often than not, waiting to be scrapped. This bay just outside of Athens is actually well known for this. End-of-life ships are often brought here and laid up, usually with no intention to ever be put into service again. Instead, their owners would leave them here until the market price of scrap metal would go up. This was almost certainly going to be the fate for the Mediterranean sky, and as the new millennium came in, she continued to sit there. But the ship's situation was slowly getting worse with time. After sitting abandoned in the bay with little to no maintenance, water began to collect on the lower decks, and the former cruise liner began to list to her starboard side. This influx of water would only get worse over time, and by 2002, it had port officials seriously concerned. In a hastily contrived move, not wanting the ship to sink in the middle of the bay, they organized a tow in November of that year. They brought the Mediterranean sky closer to shallow water near the shoreline. But as months passed, the ship continued to slowly sink. Finally, it had reached a breaking point, and while it's not entirely known for sure, it can be assumed that the poor condition of the ship's hull, especially the windows, were just no longer watertight. Once the ship listed so far to one side, more and more water was able to get in. The seawater rushing in eliminated any buoyancy or stabilization the ship had. Finally, as the ship began to capsize, she had come to rest in around 10 meters of water. The realities of this incident were apparent, as this former glitzy cruise liner had now rested on her starboard side, around 55 meters offshore in the cold water of the Bay of Eleusis. Initially, a water skimmer had been set up to try and contain any toxins that may have escaped from the ship. Since the bay it had been resting in was also an active port, there were hopes that a salvage may have been possible. Probably not one which would have refloated the vessel, but one that would cut it up and sell it for scrap. Progress on any plans of action was slow, however. Information is hard to come by regarding this, but it is known that in 2008, officials announced that they would be cleaning up the bay, which by this point had actually racked up a few wrecked vessels. But this would also land at around the same time as Greece's financial crisis, and despite a barge being sent out to the site in 2010 and 2011, no tangible work had been done. While this was seemingly put on the back burner, the sheer accessibility of the ship made it an attractive place to visit. Since the wreck was only around 55 meters or 182 feet offshore, this meant divers, kayakers, or even just random curious people on shore could easily get on board and check out what was left. From the outside, the Mediterranean sky had sat stagnant in the bay at around an 85-degree angle, firmly lodged into the rocks below, with the section of the ship that was out of the water slowly starting to deteriorate. As the steel began to rust, the white livery started to chip away, slowly revealing the former golden yellow livery underneath. By 2018, the graffiti group 1UP had actually gotten on board and painted their tag in massive block letters along the hull. Despite this new, makeshift livery, the ship still continued to decay. The wooden decking, now on a right angle, had started to rot and fall apart. This was while the interior remarkably remained the same. Since it was so close to shore, people have been able to get on board and scrap piping and wiring. But really, everything else has been left as it was. And because it is possible to get on board, there have been people that have taken photos and videos of it. One of those people was maritime illustrator Henry Brayshaw. He got on board and explored much of the interior spaces that were above the water. Incredibly, after 2 decades of sitting abandoned, much of the cabins and even public spaces are largely intact. While all loose objects fell to one side thanks to the heavy list, it's pretty unbelievable that other signs of former life remain, like beds which still have their mattresses and fitted sheets on. Cabinets with keys to all the different doors on board are still where they are, while other cabins still have all their furniture and even lamps which are still plugged in. They sit beside rotting mattresses and wall fittings, all slowly starting to fall apart. Deeper inside the wreck, the interior guest corridors are a mess of deteriorating furnishings, debris, and a gentle slope down into black water. Others who have actually dived the wreck show cabins that have been sitting half submerged. Doors are swung wide open, while bunk beds hang precariously over the waterline. The bridge too shows the fascinating juxtaposition, one side deep underwater, deteriorating away, while the other half, above the water, honestly doesn't look that bad. Even the ship's former lounges are all relatively intact, with much of the ceiling and wall styling still fitted on, while in other spaces, like the forward lounge, have all of its furniture floating aimlessly. It's all a fascinating look inside a ship pretty much frozen in time since the early 1990s. Though looking at this is also once again reactivating my submechanophobia, as the thought of being in here is pretty terrifying to me. Regardless, what's left of the Mediterranean sky today is really all that's left of her and her sister ship's legacy. The city of Port Elizabeth and the city of Durban were never converted to cruise ships, and were both scrapped in the late 70s and early 80s. Her later sister ship, the Mediterranean Sea, was ultimately scrapped in 1998. Their original builders, the Ellerman lines, in their original form at least, have been long dissolved, as have the Cara Georges line. It's very likely that if the Mediterranean sky saw similar fates, she could have very well just disappeared into history. Not necessarily notable for any one reason. She was just a vessel that had served her purpose and should have met an uneventful end of service. But that's of course not what ended up happening. The grounding and ultimate sinking would not only immortalize the ship as an iconic wreck, but it also gives a genuine look inside a ship of this era, one that had been forced to be frozen in time. It gives some significance to this otherwise innocuous ocean liner turned cruise ferry, one which may very well sit prominently along a bay in Greece for years to come. I'd like to thank Alex Moeller and Tom Linsky from HFX Studios for crafting some of the incredible visuals seen in this video, bringing the city of York and Mediterranean sky back to life. You can find their fantastic maritime and history videos at the YouTube channel Part-Time Explorer. Of course, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, you can always subscribe to this channel, Brights on Films. Anyway guys, my name is Jake, and thank you very much for watching.